Russia and North Korea have taken a step toward improving relations as President Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a strategic partnership agreement today. Both sides pledged to help each other's defense and security and to fight off sanctions. Stephanie Tsai has the story.
As the Russian jet rolled in to Pyongyang, the North Koreans rolled out the red carpet. Leader Kim Jong-un welcomed President Vladimir Putin to North Korea for the first time in 24 years. As Putin looks for support for his war in Ukraine, Kim hopes to find an economic and military ally. The tone for the summit was set with a sturdy embrace. In recent years, the countries have flirted with stronger ties. Kim Jong-un first traveled to Russia in 2019 and again in 2023 to meet Putin, but neither trip produced a formal alliance. The U.S. accuses North Korea of sending ammunition and weapons to Russia for its war in Ukraine and worries that in exchange, Russia is boosting North Korea's nuclear program. Kim and Putin have denied it, since such a trade would violate UN sanctions. But in March, a Russian veto on the Security Council ended the UN's monitoring of nuclear sanctions on North Korea and raised alarm bells.
We highly appreciate your consistent and unwavering support for Russian policy. I'm referring to our fight against the hegemonic policy imposed for decades, the imperialist policy of the United States and its satellites.
Today's summit formalized the strongest relationship between the two countries since the Cold War.
Our two countries' relations have been elevated to a new high level of alliance, laying the legal groundwork for the grand ideas of leadership of the two countries.
The treaty includes military technical cooperation between the two countries, a mutual defense pact, and opposition to Western sanctions against North Korea. Before the agreement was announced, the Pentagon raised red flags.
The deepening cooperation between Russia and the DPRK is something that should be of concern.
What happens in Europe matters for Asia, and what happens in Asia matters for us.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg appeared with Secretary of State Antony Blinken yesterday ahead of the summit.
We've seen, as you've said, Russia try in desperation to develop and to strengthen relations with countries that can provide it with what it needs to continue the war of aggression that it started against Ukraine.
In Pyongyang, the state visit came to an end with dinner and drinks as the two leaders made a show of their deepening partnership. While the details of what the Russians and North Koreans agreed to has not been made public, some observers are concerned. For more, we turn to Robert Gallucci. He was the U.S. State Department's lead negotiator with North Korea in 1994, when the North agreed to freeze its nuclear program in exchange for economic benefits. He's also a professor at Georgetown University. Robert, thank you so much for joining the NewsHour. So Putin and Kim announced they signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, and Putin called it a breakthrough document. As we start to see some details come out, do you see it that way? Is it a big deal?
It is important and negative. I think it is both those things, but it's not a fundamental change in the nature of relations of major states. It isn't good news in terms of what the North Koreans have been supplying the Russians so that they can more effectively prosecute their invasion and war against Ukraine. That's not good news. And on the other hand, we can't be really sure what it is exactly the Russians are going to transfer to the North Koreans.
Yeah, let's break down the significant parts of what we do know, starting with what Putin called military technical cooperation. Do you think that is a concerning development, the announcement of that? And what could it mean as far as Pyongyang's nuclear weapons capability? What could they transfer?
The key issue is, will the Russians materially assist the North Koreans in having a more effective, more threatening nuclear weapons capability? And by that, I mean not only the weapons themselves, will they be thermonuclear weapons assistance as opposed to simple fission weapons? Will, in other words, the yield go up? Will the confidence that the North Koreans have in their weapons go up thanks to Russian assistance? Will the delivery vehicles the ballistic missiles, particularly the intercontinental ballistic missiles. There have for a long time been real questions about whether the North should have any confidence in their ICBMs, their ability to deliver nuclear weapons against continental United States, given that they can't be sure that the warheads containing these nuclear weapons would actually survive the trip and reentry and work effectively. And it's not clear at all when, in what we understand, will be the language of this, if it's when and if it's released, that the Russians are committing to make these kinds of transfers.
I assume those would be violations of international law and sanctions. Both countries have been under varying sanctions, especially North Korea. And if you believe U.S. officials, both are already violating these sanctions through these arms and ammunition transfers to do with Ukraine. You have engaged in high-level diplomacy with North Korea in the past. What can and should be done now by the Biden administration?
We should deplore what the Russian move signals, and that is, first, no longer a willingness on the part of the Russians to see the direction of events to lead to an eventual denuclearization of the peninsula. In other words, the Russians had been aboard with the Chinese and the rest of the world at sanctioning, UN sanctions, sanctioning the North Koreans for their ballistic missile and nuclear weapons development. I think this, if it does nothing else, signals the Russians are no longer aboard, and that ought to be deplored and ought to be criticized.
You said it was bad news. Is it also bad news that part of this agreement includes a mutual defense pact?
I do not know what it means. I certainly, even if I had the text in front of me, and nobody does, as I understand it, it's hard to tell. I mean, when the Russians make a deal, and they have been clear, they don't call it an alliance. The North called it an alliance, but not the Russians. I mean, the last time the Russians made a security commitment that I know of like this was 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum, when they promised that they would not threaten Ukraine's security. Well, we all know what that was worth. We all ought to remember nothing has changed here, really. The North has been providing this military aid to the Russians. The Russians are still pursuing their invasion of Ukraine. We have talked about the one thing that might be important and different, and that is if the Russians started supplying technical assistance to the weapons of mass destruction and delivery vehicles that the North Koreans have been developing for the last 25 years.
Robert Gallucci, thank you so much for joining us with your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thank you much.